Thank you so much, everyone, for coming here today. We have the privilege of having Dr. Sanaa Alimia here with us to speak on her latest book on refugee cities, how Afghans changed urban Pakistan. And we're even more privileged to have her 3-month-old baby Yusra here with us as well. It is quite an honor for us to host both mother and baby. And surely Yusra is going to be a centerpiece of our book talk today. And I'm sure she's one of the biggest champions of Dr. Sanaa's research and book. So before I go on, I just want to take a minute to say a few words about the book talk. So this Ideas Book Talk series is basically meant to showcase contemporary research on Pakistan. We all know that research on Pakistan is burgeoning at the moment across disciplines, and it's wonderful to see so many new works coming out. अगर आपके ख्याल में कोई ऐसी किताब है जो आप recommend करना चाहें for our series, please feel free to do that. Also, importantly, this book talk is a collaboration between Ideas and Bazm-e-AaLam, which is a cultural organization, a collective which works on interfaith culture and interfaith harmony. And it basically is a testimony to Bazm-e-AaLam's sort of centrality to the book talk series, that we do try and keep a 15-minute conversation slot at the end of the book talk to discuss some themes on interfaith and intercultural harmony that we can draw upon, the book for the day. Any sort of broader lessons that we can draw from the scholarship to talk about where Pakistan stands today at the contemporary moment. And having said that, I want to now just introduce Dr. Sanaa to the audience. She is an associate professor of political science at the Afghan University Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations based in London. She holds a PhD from SOAS and an MSc from the London School of Economics. And she is the author of Refugee Cities, which was first published in 2022 by Pen Press and locally now by Folio Books. We also are very happy to have a bookstall by Folio Books. So please do buy Refugee Cities, because you will have a great opportunity today to get your copy inscribed by the author herself. Alongside academic publications, Dr. Sanaa also writes in the media and in the policy worlds. She has previously held positions as a visiting associate professor at the University of Peshawar, which was from 2013 to 2018. That was also the time frame during which I believe you undertook a lot of your field work for this book. She has been a Dahlem Research Fellow at the Berlin Graduate School of Muslim Societies and Cultures, Free University at Berlin, and also held a position as a Research Fellow at the Leibniz Zentrum Moderner Orient from 2016 to 2019. Currently, she's also working on another project, which is a British Academy funded project that examines digital borders, bodies, and mobility in South Asia. Please do join me in welcoming Dr. Sanaa. I want to just take one more minute and say a couple of words about this work, a couple of distinctive ideas that Dr. Sanaa really foregrounds for us. Of course, the broad theme of the book is how Afghan refugees have actually experienced being in Pakistan, how they have also constituted identities within different cities. And so two concepts really stand out for me, at least as a reader. One of them is the title itself, Refugee Cities. And why do we focus on the city as the site for understanding how refugees, particularly Afghan refugees, have come to experience their time in Pakistan? That's one. And the second really crucial concept is the concept of a people's history. The approach to her research is very much bottom-up. And so it's very interesting to me, taking a sort of wide lens to contemporary Pakistani scholarship, that a lot of it is now trying to understand how to write histories from the ground up. So this is not a history of the nation state identity making, even though of course that's also very important. But you will see that across disciplines, whether history ho, sociology ho, political science हो, socio-legal scholarship हो, एक सवाल ये उठ रहा है कि what does history look like when it's written from the perspective of the people, ground up. And those are two really important concepts. So over to you, Sanaa. I want you to perhaps start off by sharing some self-reflections on this particular piece of research before we get into the meat of it. Say something about your own motivation to write on Afghan refugees and their experience, and maybe also a bit about your positionality as a researcher.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here and for the very kind and generous invitation. Yusra, the little baby, I'm sure will be having fun with us in the course of the talk. But you know, I'm thinking now it's 2025, and I started working on this topic about 15 years ago. A lot of the time, it's been quite a lonely journey. And you'll just have to forgive me, this is standing and speaking, if that's okay, just because it's a bit easier with the baby. So for me, it's been quite an interesting journey and quite a lonely journey in many ways, because I always find it quite striking. I'm very pleased to have had recognition of the book in more recent months and the past couple of years, certainly within Pakistan, both from people within the academy and outside of it. But it's also quite striking to me as well that this is one of the first kind of manuscripts written on the Afghan story in Pakistan. It's something that I think should have been probably done a long time ago. It's been a long time coming, mainly because the Afghan story in Pakistan is so significant and has been for the past 40 years at least. I also think I am half Pakistani, as I was saying to Dr. Maryam before. I'm half Pakistani, specifically Kashmiri actually. So my mother sometimes tells me off for calling myself Pakistani because of the politics of all of these things, and half Yemeni. But what would also be wonderful to see in the years ahead is if we can have more voices, including Afghan voices who are from the country and have, in sociological terms, become Pakistani in many ways, also writing on and around this topic. I think sometimes I think of what motivated me to write the topic, but I also think what motivates me to still continue writing on the topic after 15 years. And one of the motivations that I have about still writing on the topic is partly, I think, abhi bhi bahut hi theorizing ki zarurat hai. There's a lot of need for theorizing on how refugees transform cities, certainly within the context of Pakistan. Pakistan, a country founded by refugees, founded by migrants, still has this perception about state-making migrants, which are those who migrated in 1947, and state-breaking migrants, which is kind of how Afghan refugees have been constructed certainly in the media and mainstream policy and discourse in recent years. And the reasons why I still continue to work on this topic are to do with the fact that there is more theorization that is needed, but also we understand certainly events since October 2023 have showed us that, you know, the mass amounts of deportations that were taking place of Afghans within Pakistan, that a lot of work needs to be done, not just academic and scholarly work, but also political work and organizing work in terms of trying to bring to light the Afghan story in Pakistan, to try to bring to light the Afghan story in Pakistan in more in-depth ways. So the reason why I still continue to work on this topic is really very much related to these two kind of issues, both the need for theorization, but also merging the political dimension of the work. So writing a people's history is never going to be completely confined to the academy. एक लिहाज से मैं recognize भी करती हूँ कि I am a university professor. I get paid to do this research. I get paid to hold a profession. I get the kudos of writing something that is considered to be quite interesting. So I recognize that, and I say that, and I bring that to the room because transparency is necessary, right? It's important to be transparent in this regard. But at the same time, when you're writing a people's history, if it is only confined to the academy, it often ends up being somewhat of a problem, at least in my own vantage point of view. The reason why I chose to work and write on this particular topic was because I had an intellectual interest on refugees, on migration, on events within Pakistan as well. I felt enough attachment and lived experiences within Pakistan to recognize that this was something that needed to be studied and needed to be brought to a wider attention. Part of that was within the academy, and part of the reason for this book being out in this way is an academic reason. But there have been multiple activities that have also taken place outside of the academy, which have felt necessarily and also a moral obligation that I've had as a scholar, as well as a political obligation as a scholar to continue to write and think about this topic in a broader way. And, I think thinking about, why it is that I got into this topic in the first place, I also just think that it's one of those things where it was almost an intuitive kind of need and an intuitive urge of having seen people living in cities, in Karachi, for example, which I was very familiar with, that you see Afghans part and parcel of the city, but they're not necessarily written about or spoken about. And maybe as somebody who herself is a migrant and of diaspora, I felt that this was something that was necessarily important to do as well at the same time.
That's wonderful. And 15 साल से आपका ये काम चल रहा है.
जी बिल्कुल.
And you focus on 2 cities which you feel are probably the most crucial in terms of understanding city making and identity formation.
जी.
And those 2 are Karachi and Peshawar.
जी.
उसके बारे में थोड़ा बताइए कि आपने कितना वक्त spend kiya in each of the cities. What is the research process is very, very exhaustive. It's very, it's lengthy, it's extensive. Mm-hmm. And yes, you may be doing this from within the academy as, somebody who holds that institutional prestige. And but even so, I mean, this has been a major probably transformation for you personally as well. Mm-hmm. So if you could say something about what made you choose those 2 cities and in comparison, and how much time you spent there, and also the sources you used, all the interviews and ethnographies you did.
Yeah, I think Karachi I wanted to write about because Karachi for me is a Pashtun city, right? Which is something that is more and more becoming kind of, accepted. And when the Afghan population in Karachi is not all Pashtun. It's often Turkmen, Tajik, Hazara, Pashtun, Tajik, and a mixture and an array of people. But there was a wonderful scholar who has passed away, Maryam Abu Zahab, who wrote a lot on kind of Afghanistan and Islam and political Islam, as well as Pakistan. And I remember hearing her once at a conference when I had decided that I was going to work on Karachi, saying that, somebody needs to study Karachi as a city, as an Afghan city, and as a Pashtun city. And I was reassured when hearing such a, giant of scholarship saying that this was something that needed to be focused on. And this really was one of the key reasons why I wanted to focus on Karachi, just because it was a city that I had spent a lot of time in, and I had seen many people from different ethnicities, as different nationalities living in the city. And it felt like a real, migrant city in many ways. But where is the Afghan story, so venerated in Lahore, in Punjab, in the city of partition? Partition lives on in people's memories, as well as national memories in day-to-day conversations. But Pakistan's migration story, of course, doesn't stop at 1947. It continues on. 1971 is a big year, of course. The 1980s, when you have Afghans migrating in, is a huge story. Pakistan's diaspora of migrant workers going to the Gulf, back and forth, rural to urban migrations. It is very much a story of migration within Pakistan. and outside of it. In the UK, I often say to friends and to colleagues, we have such a rich diaspora there, but it's not just people who are second, third, or fourth generation. Waves and waves of people and us keep on coming. Partly that is to do with the political economy of Pakistan itself, which forces people and pushes people away from city centres. But there's also so much that pulls people regionally to cities within Pakistan. And Peshawar was a city that I wanted to focus on because I think academically, actually, not much has been written about Peshawar. Within the context of South Asian studies and within the context of writings on Pakistan, a lot has been written on Karachi in many ways. It's almost, if you want to study urbanity, if you want to study the city, Karachi becomes a focus. या historically अगर आपने focus करना है आप लाहौर के ऊपर focus करेंगे. लेकिन पेशावर के ऊपर काफ़ी कम academic publications है. There isn't really much telling us about what's happening in Peshawar. A lot of the writings that we've seen, and part of my reasons, coming back to motivations for why did I choose this particular topic, I think a lot of the writings on Afghanistan and a lot of the writings on Afghanistan and on Pakistan and on Peshawar, they tended to be through tropes of the Pashtun, through prisms of terror, through tropes of the war on terror, or through the Soviet Union and the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, the civil war, the Taliban 1.0, the US invasion, Taliban 2.0, AFPAC became a really common way of understanding the region and understanding Peshawar. And it just, these tropes of Islamophobia, of what the ultimate Muslim should look like. These were the stories, AFPAC became a term that was coined in 2009. And you have, in the 2000s. And in 2009, I remember Foreign Policy and International Relations magazine producing these reams and reams of literature on AFPAC. And I couldn't recognize what this AFPAC was from my experiences of Pakistan. War, of course, is happening. And Zahir frontier regions, frontier ilaqon mein, Peshawar mein, KP mein, former FATA ke ilaqon mein, that's the biggest areas that are impacted by war and by conflict. लेकिन इसका ये नहीं मतलब कि सिर्फ हाइपर मैस्कुलिनाइज्ड किस्म के जंग्स चल रही हैं. असर भी होता है लोगों के ऊपर. वो क्या असर है? That was what I was intrigued in trying to understand what's actually happening in Peshawar. And the scholars Anila Dolatzai, who is a medical anthropologist, and the historian Shah Mahmood Hanifi, they speak about how it is that Pashtuns, but also Afghanistan itself as a geography, the tribal areas themselves as a geography, have been almost exceptionally orientalized, to use Edward Said's term. They've been exceptionally orientalized, but not just by the West and not just by European academics or American academics, but also within the subcontinent, also by South Asians. Also, we're sitting in Punjab, heartland Lahore, where, your dramas, geodramas such as Khay, which came out last year. I don't know if anybody saw it, but it was an incredibly kind of, full of various racialized tropes about the Pashtun, about frontier regions, about Afghanistan. And these were so common, but don't really necessarily tell us really the full picture of what's happening during big geopolitical conflicts. And, I use the example that I have of one of my interlocutors in the book, Engineer Aziz, who was a former Mujahideen fighter. So he fought on the front lines in Afghanistan, but actually most of his time was spent as a mazdoor building roads in Peshawar during the 1980s and 1990s. Ye nahi hai ki sirf wo jang ja ke lad rahe the in this kind of very glorified way. In the 1980s, the Soviet-Afghan War is really remembered and romanticized both in cultural production in Hollywood media. You think of Rambo, it's Rambo 3, that kind of old school movie. Or even amongst kind of Arab friends and colleagues that I have, Palestinians, from Palestinians to Yemeni, we often kind of romanticize that era of the 1980s, the Afghan resistance where people were fighting, with basic equipment against the Soviet Union. And a hyper-masculinized but also romanticized era is kind of in the popular memory. But the ground level reality was much more complicated than that. It wasn't just about these kind of glorious wars. You had lots of money, lots of funds coming in. You also had many refugee camps, but you also had an urban transformation that takes place in Peshawar. You can't think of neighborhoods like Hayatabad in Peshawar without thinking of actually Afghan laborers in the 1980s. Now that has changed, where you have, in more recent years, more laborers that are building main roads in Peshawar and in KP are not necessarily just from Afghans and Afghan refugees, but also coming in from Punjab as labor patterns have changed, as construction has also shifted hands from private enterprises and companies to being more state-led and heavily state-led. So you see construction having changes, but it's also about, I guess, telling different stories and trying to complicate how it is and reimagine, these narratives of war and of conflict. So why Peshawar and why Karachi? A lot of my rationale and reasons for this was to disrupt the narratives and also to say, well, actually, the story that we've been told so far doesn't fit. It doesn't fit for me. It doesn't fully make sense to me. And part of that was telling the story through migration and through refugees. But it was also just not about, telling people's histories and telling these stories is about complicating our understandings of war, but also complicating our understanding of refugees and of migrants. Because on the flip side of the geopolitics of hypermasculinity, of war, you have helpless suffering. You have Angelina Jolie going around and visiting refugee camps. You have Steve McCurry's famous Afghan girl and photos of helpless suffering, of the poor woman who can't do anything, or of the poor refugee who cannot do anything themselves. And, the idea is not to write a people's history or to witness and to document as a means of eliciting sympathy for the perfect victim. And nor is it to say, well, look at how Afghans have built roads and transformed cities in itself. The role for me as the academic and as the scholar and as somebody who's trying to think and piece these things together is also to intellectualize it, to think about it, to bring it into a language of rights. And this is what much of my work tries to do.
Now, that's a brilliant sort of sweep of, some of the broad themes of your book. And I just want to say that it's really heartening to see a lot of new political science works on Pakistan, which are so deeply historically rich. So even though aapka jo actual field work tha, kaam tha, that spans over 4 decades. So you start with the late 70s and go all the way up to contemporary times till 2021. But even so, I mean, you do make a huge effort to historicize even those 4 decades. So we go back to what you were saying earlier about the Afghans being perceived as the state breaking refugees, right? And this whole history of the ungovernable frontier, as you call it, between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the colonial racialization and the continuity in the post-colonial period. But also it's very interesting how you say that there are so many shifts and Afghan refugees have been at the receiving end of those perceptions also radically and rapidly shifting, right? So like you say, popular culture in the 80s is more glorifying things, exoticizing rather, right? So it's very Orientalist lens. And then we come to the war on terror in the 2000s, and that narrative almost kind of flips 180 degrees. So now these are criminals, right? And they're taking over your space and your cities, and they're outsiders. So there's this whole sort of othering which is happening. And so you draw that arc, and we don't really have the time to go into those details, but you're particularly looking at how this shifting terrain is taking place late 70s through the 2000s up till now. I just want you to walk us through what is happening in recent years. So what has happened after the war on terror, this whole sort of really complex document regime that has come up. कि ये आईडी कार्ड हो तो इसका ये मतलब है, ये आईडी कार्ड आपके पास है तो ये मतलब है, इसके अलावा 6 और डॉक्यूमेंट्स निकालें अगर आपने फलानी चीज़ प्रूव करनी है, all of that. The tyranny of the document, and particularly the tyranny of the digitized document and the biometrics and all of those things that then, of course, can't be divorced from state policy towards surveillance and this notion that, Afghans don't belong to Pakistan, they should voluntarily repatriate. So if you could say a few words.
Interesting documentation जो पाकिस्तान के अंदर आई हुई है, पूरी दुनिया के अंदर आई हुई है, काफ़ी changes आ गए surveillance regimes के साथ, especially, and will continue to change also with AI and new technology. AI is being used increasingly for migration management as well. Now, overall, of course, we know that documentation in and of itself is not a problem, right? The state often wants to document, sometimes to give rights. If the state knows who the population is within the territory and within its territories, it will be able to, give you social welfare benefits. You will receive free healthcare. You will receive free education. So there isn't a problem necessarily with documentation or even surveillance per se in this regard. But what happens with the Afghan story is that a lot of times documentation is about understanding who you are, so the state can know who you are, with the purpose of not including you in the demos, but excluding you from the demos. We see this, for example, even in the case of Palestinians in Gaza right now undergoing a genocide. The numbers and the data and the statistics of people is so significant, not just because of, the health ministry that is run by Palestinian authorities, but also actually because the Israeli state and the military occupation has been so particular about knowing who the populations are within its territories, so that it can engage in purposes, in this case, in the Israeli case, to engage in a genocide and ethnic cleansing. Now, the Pakistani state doesn't want to, and so far is not engaged in a genocide against Afghans, although we do have to say that Afghan life in the past 40 years has been considered very cheap, given how many millions of people have been displaced but also killed in perpetual wars that have taken place in Afghanistan, in which the Afghan elites are responsible, but so are so many external powers, including the one and the state in which we're sitting, as well as, of course, our usual suspects in the West as well, or the Soviet Union. So the perpetual wars in Afghanistan and life being cheap is a consequence of these repeated interventions. But of course, the Pakistani state wanting to know who belongs to its territories and who is a member of the state and a full citizen of the state or non-citizen, in the Afghan case is done to be able to effectively grapple these numbers, understand who's a part of the country, with this purpose of pushing Afghans out of the country. And this is something that's really taken shape since the 2000s. And surveillance has been an important part of this mechanism, the ID card, the documentation. Zehra Hashmi is a wonderful scholar who's done some really important work looking at Nadra and what it's doing to Pakistani citizens. And a lot of my work was trying to focus on what these documentations and ID cards are doing to Afghans within Pakistan. And what we really see happening is that, of course, surveillance, Pakistan in the 2000s, early 2000s, faces a lot of pressure by European countries, the EU, as well as the UK and the West, effectively, to have better grasp over its populations, mainly because, as I've mentioned, we produce a lot of outward migration, right? So knowing who is coming in and out of the country, as well as the global war on terror and when that starts, the Muslim body in the global migration regime, particularly the Muslim male body, is considered to be quite a threat to global security. And what we see happening in Pakistan is that, that's being listened to, that's being taken heed of by government authorities. It's interesting to understand who's funding a lot of the surveillance and the ID cards and computerized ID cards, what information is being shared across different governments, when that's being shared across different governments. A lot of times when you have asylum cases or deportation cases is, I act as a legal expert for many asylum cases in Europe. And a lot of the time the cases are, is Nadra data effective? Is it official? Can this be used to deport somebody back or not deport them back? And what you see happening is that the documentation and the data becomes much more sophisticated in the 2000s, 2010s, partly because of this external pressure, but also because of local politics. Now, as you mentioned, and as we've been discussing, the 1980s is a period of romanticized kind of, the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, FATA regions is a blurred border, and that's a good thing in the 80s because it means that the base of the resistance can be funded from Peshawar or from Quetta. And of course, in the 2001 onwards, when the war on terror starts happening, it's no longer beneficial to have a blurred border in this way. Pakistan joins the war on terror on the side of the US, even if sometimes it might be playing a bit of a double game. Right? It joins the side of the war on the side of the US. Now it becomes more beneficial to have that border between Afghanistan and Pakistan to be more clear, to be more rigid. How do you do that? Not just by erecting a fence, but by controlling population flows, because the nation state is defined by population, territory, and sovereignty. Knowing who is coming in and out of the country is important. And this is when the documentation takes on a more of an oppressive role. Now, documentation, and for those who lived in Pakistan and who are old enough to remember the 2000s, 2010s, everywhere is a checkpoint. हर जगह पे नाका हुए, धमाके भी बहुत होते थे उस time पे. So there was generally more sense of checking and checkposts and having ID cards, and they were really important for anybody who was suspected to be Pashtun when they're moving and navigating Lahore or Karachi. It was a very difficult time, whether or not you were a Pakistani citizen or if you had been a non-Pakistani citizen. These were very difficult times. And that is when the ID card becomes tyrannical and very oppressive in a way. Because on your ID card, if you have got the Pakistani Shanakhti card is written in Urdu, as well as English, you have the government signature, the government symbol on there. Whereas the Afghan cards that were given, they also marked you out much more clearly as not belonging, because nothing was written in Urdu. It was all in English. It still is in English, the Afghan POR card. So if a police wala is looking at your card, to wo dekhenge ki ye kya card hai? And there have been a lot of really important education campaigns that have been taking place since then by journalists, by lawyers, by activists, and by organizers on the ground, particularly in places like Karachi, but also in Islamabad. But it really created a sense of fear. Now you get a Shanakhti card, CNIC card to milta hai 18 saal ke baad. POR card aapko milta hai. The Afghan card that was given was from the age of 5 onwards, right? And anybody who was born to an Afghan parents have to have their cards put on the back of the card as well. And so these were cards that were given to people who were classified or considered to be refugees. But since then, there have been different tiers of Afghan categories that have come in as well. Afghan citizens or economic migrants who also need to be counted. Knowing who belongs or who doesn't belong becomes an important way of saying, well, we're going to not include you, but we're going to gradually push you out. And of course, that's really what's been happening. And we've seen it accelerate in 2023. But it wasn't just happening in 2023. It's been happening, throughout the 2000s and 2010s in quite significant ways, where mass arrests and deportations have been quite normal. So I think that's kind of where you see these documentations and these surveillance regimes, really taking shape and becoming tyrannical in that way. But obviously, the question that you have to ask is, well, what happens if you have no documentation? Now, for people who don't have any documentation, baaz daf'a wo Pakistani citizens bhi ho sakte hain, jinke paas documentation nahi hota. People who are very poor, ya kisi very small remote village se ho sakte, ya Afghan bhi ho sakte, ya Bangladeshi ho sakte, Sri Lankan ho sakte. Agar aapke paas koi documentation nahi hota, to phir do you even exist? And then life becomes much more localized, much more terrifying in that way. So, having documentation, if you're an Afghan with some form of documentation, that's still better than having no documentation, because the state matters. Ultimately, it's not that sometimes it might feel like it, but we don't exist in a place where there's no state. Actually the state is very powerful, might not be so powerful when it comes down to social welfare, like in social security ke मामले में, not social security, state security के मामले में बहुत ही ताकतमंद है. सोशल वेलफेयर के मामले में, सोशल सिक्योरिटी मामले में, पानी है नहीं है, मजदूर है नहीं है, क्या चलो वो ठीक है अपनी जगह पे, लेकिन जियोपॉलिटिकल लिहाज से it's very important. Now it's and I bring this up because I also think it's no coincidence that Afghans are enumerated in ways that Bangladeshis, Sri Lankans and others haven't been.
Yes.
Right? Their geopolitical significance as bodies, populations matter, bodies matter. We as beings are not just neutral and walking around. Sometimes we will be read as the status, racialized subjects, ethnicized subjects, gendered subjects, geopolitically significant subjects.
ये बात बहुत अहम है, and if I might kind of elaborate on this, कि for instance Bengali citizens or Bengalis rather living in Karachi and elsewhere, the state is not at all concerned about their enumeration, but it wants to make the Afghan refugees legible for specific regions. So for specific reasons rather. And so there's an interesting asymmetry from one community to the other when it comes to documentation and the consequences of that documentation. So that's very interesting. And the other thing that you also emphasized was the mirroring of global politics. तो मुश्किल है कि एक मुल्क आपका अलहदा से या in isolation इस तरह के steps लें. There's a larger global context which you've also laid out, which is to say that there's a global normalization, as you say, of anti-migrant governance.
Bilkul.
And so this is something which is happening across the globe. And so that sort of helps you understand that what's happening with Afghan refugees in Pakistan is not in that sense localized, right? So it's drawing from a larger sort of global objectives and how things are changing around the world. So that's very, very interesting. Now I come to, I think what from a conceptual standpoint was very, very exciting to me, thinking about migration, mobility and urbanity, and this idea of refugee cities. So there is a very sort of interesting, positive almost story to be told here. It's a hopeful story of how Afghan refugees have actually done so much to constitute some of these cities, their local contexts, their communities, their neighborhoods, and how cities are made by its inhabitants. और ये बड़े मज़े की और दिलचस्प एक बात है कि आपकी चाहे नेशनल लेवल पे एक सिटीजनशिप ना हो, जो एक फॉर्मल आपकी स्टेट की सिटीजनशिप होती है, लेकिन व्हेन यू आर कमिंग डाउन एट द लेवल ऑफ द लोकेलिटी और द सिटी, de facto we see the emergence of what we would refer to as an urban citizen. Could you say a bit more about what you mean by urban citizenship and how it relates to identity formation of cities themselves, not just communities?
हाँ बिल्कुल. I mean I think it's बहुत ही मज़े की बात है कि कोई कहेगा कि मैं लंदन की हूँ, मैं कराची की हूँ, लेकिन ये नहीं कहेंगे कि I'm British or I'm Pakistani. There were many Afghans who I used to meet and still meet who would say, okay, I'm from Karachi or I'm from Peshawar, but do not have an attachment to the nation state. Understandably, क्योंकि अगर वो nation state आपको, लाते मार रहा है, or, consider, for example, the incredible Islamophobia of the recent UK or European governments and right-wing parties. Of course, what happens for Muslims in these contexts or racialized subjects is the ability to feel and express affinity to that nation state. Sometimes, not in all cases, might be more restricted. But the city is an interesting place, particularly multicultural cities, or where you have different ethnicities, different nationalities, different classes, different genders as well, living space side by side. The city, because of the nature of space, अगर आप स्पेस के बारे में सोचिए, आपकी तंग तंग गलियाँ होगी, फ्लैट्स होंगे, अपार्टमेंट्स होंगे, आपकी फ्रीक्वेंसी ऑफ इंटरेक्शंस लोगों के साथ बहुत ज़्यादा होगी, मुख्तलिफ लोग होंगे. You're going to be seeing lots of the sensory feeling of the city, you move from one end to the other, you look outside and you can see different rhythms, different forms of day-to-day life, which allow the city in a way to not necessarily always be in full control by the state as well. It's often the people who are forming that. Now it depends. You know, Islamabad is a very much government city, for example. Washington DC is a very much government-based city where it is a center of power. But some other cities, they have these spatial kind of interactions and frequencies of exchange that allow something else to kind of come forward and be formed there in a way that is more inclusive and encompassing than the nation state, which is often exclusionary. And the city allows for these kind of new identities to form. And oftentimes in the global south, because the state is present but is absent, you have these informal spaces, kachi abadis, informal bastis, electricity idhar se udhar se leke aana hai, wahan se leke aana hai, pani idhar se udhar se leke aana hai, to logon ne saath kaam karna hota hai majbooran. Not ke this is, I'm not romanticizing the city. You get to be living in, and most of the subjects that I work with are from low-income households. It's not that they are part of the elite. I don't focus on the Afghan elite, and there is an Afghan elite as well. Lekin meri focus unke upar nahi hoti. Meri focus zyadatar kachi abadiyon ke upar thi. That's where I did a lot of my oral histories. And what is very clear and is that there isn't a romanticization of what life is like in these informal settlements. Honi bhi nahi chahiye. And actually, a lot of the purpose of my own writing is not to romanticize the poor and not to romanticize, but to see how we are all implicated in the structures, the historical and the material conditions that allow these inequalities to persist. But because of necessity, people are forced to and do work along side by side with each other. And jab ye processes kar rahe hote, they form something new. And sometimes something exciting, sometimes something creative, but something changes and shifts happen there. And that's really interesting, where the city allows these new identities to be formed. And historically, agar hum dekhte hain, to cities are often the sites of politics, right? The city is where political formations and citizenship emerges. If you look at the etymology of the word cities and citizenship, you know, they're interconnected with each other for precisely this reason.
That's brilliant. And maybe say a few words also about the idea of rights assertion. तो जब मेरी तरह के बोरिंग लॉयर्स राइट्स की बात करते हैं तो हम तो ज़्यादातर आइन की तरफ देखते हैं और हम कहते हैं कि उसके अंदर ये आपकी सिविल और पॉलिटिकल राइट्स हैं. But these rights are the very, very basic rights of, and your work particularly focuses on water, housing and shelter, and everyday utilities. I mean, this is survival, you know. And if you could maybe draw on some anecdotal references or examples of like how are these communities of refugees asserting these rights, in what form? And because, I mean, the whole idea of urban citizenship, you argue, is grounded in this idea of like assertion of these basic rights.
हाँ बिल्कुल. देखें, अगर लोगों को पानी की ज़रूरत है, वो पूछेंगे नहीं. They're going to try to get those rights themselves and organize those rights. And a lot of the times, a lot of the folks that I worked with, जिन लोगों के साथ मैंने काम किया है, they often understood. वो कहते थे कि हमने इस शहर को बनाया. They were very clear that they had made cities like Peshawar, or even places like Karachi as well, that they had made these cities and therefore have a right to basic goods, basic rights, basic services, water, sanitation. Often इंसानियत के अल्फाज use करके, you know, इंसानियत के मामला है, we're due our rights of water. And the ways in which people would get access to it, and now I'm just looking at a wonderful picture of a water pump. बिल्कुल यहाँ पे मेरे को सामने नजर आया. People would try to get, you know, informal access to water. चाहे वो पंप के लिहाज हो, चाहे वो टैंकी के लिहाज हो, चाहे वाटर टैंक, चाहे अवामी टैंक, चाहे रेंजर्स के टैंक से आ रही है. But people would try to get informal access to water or electricity or shelter. And this was often, it was a recognition of their labor and how they have created and transformed cities. And that was very clear. There was no, we're going to wait. But it was like, this is hamara haq hai, insani huquq hai, as well as politically rights. But what was interesting is that, again, to come back on to not romanticizing the poor, a lot of the times the people and communities I worked on could not get access to this themselves. ये नहीं है कि बस उन्होंने फैसला कर दिया कि हमने बस इस ज़मीन के ऊपर बैठना है and हमने पानी यहाँ से निकालना है. नहीं, there was always a middleman, there was always somebody there, there's always a government official, there's always a state official, जिनके साथ उनकी interactions होने की, they were always interacting with them. ये लाजमी था, ज़रूरी था कि उन्होंने interact करना है किसी official बंदे के साथ. And what this shows us is that the state acts in different ways for different groups of people. It relies on informality. Informality is not something that's happening hidden way over there, then the state doesn't know about it. The state very much knows about it and is very much central part of it. We all know this from our day-to-day interactions and conversations, jahan hum dekhte hain. But it just chooses to act very differently in DHA than it will in a Kachi Abadi, right? And it chooses to do so. And this is where these productions and tropes around class, caste, ethnicity become so powerful because they enable this. I'm often reminded, मैं बाज़ दफ़ा मुझे थोड़ा सा झटका लगता है लाहौर आके कि ये class and caste relations इतनी ज़बरदस्त है यहाँ पे. And it's often upheld, discursively be upheld होती है. A lot of times in conversations, in cultural production, or in day-to-day interactions, it's so powerful and so pronounced, even compared to other cities in Pakistan. And that you're reminded that these material conditions of inequalities are also enabled by the discourses that are practiced, but are also just often upheld by those in power because there's some kind of benefit. So I think that what we see happening is people are very much aware of the inequalities that they are subject to. They're very much aware of what needs to be done to navigate these inequalities. They're also aware that they are due rights. It's not a language of someone's doing someone a favor. It's a very kind of well-versed political articulation of what people are due.
And you also mentioned the role of women
Yes.
as bridges across these communities in this process of rights assertion, identity formation, city building, city making. But it feels like maybe in the book you don't have a lot of space to really kind of explore on that theme. And I was wondering if you'd want to say a few words about how women are so central to this entire process.
Yeah, I mean, one of the chapters is actually all about women, right? When they're kind of resisting their homes from being bulldozed in Karachi. It kind of shows how in an informal Kachiyawadi, I did a lot of my work is effectively microhistories. So that's going into an area and seeing how it was made over a period of years and interviewing people and saying, ye ilaka kaise bana tha, kab bana tha, government officials ke saath, archives, maps ko jaake dekhna. And one of the areas that I worked in was actually, I was trying to understand how this area ultimately gets bulldozed down and what's the history behind that area. And in that story, you see that women are very much on the front lines of trying to protect their homes, of trying to prevent it from being bulldozed. The gender dimension was also an interesting one because I wasn't fully 100%. I just wanted it to be a part of the story without having the gendered focus and without saying that gender doesn't matter because it does. Patriarchal structures, inequalities, all of these things persist. But because almost writing on gender and the Afghan woman and the Pashtun woman was such a trope, I didn't want to do it in this way. I wanted to show kind of what it is that these women and these communities are having to navigate on a day-to-day basis, when oftentimes it's not just about being a woman, but it's about being someone who's poor, or someone who's a refugee, or someone who's a migrant. Unke kya challenges hai? So a lot of the times in the spaces that I was working on, women were on the front line, not just because they were women, but because they were poor, or they might be a refugee, or they might be a displaced person. And what you see happening there in a lot of the work that I was doing is that women are, of course, part of this shared class, ethnic, and national story in a way. And a lot of times really important and very vulnerable to even greater forms of violence than men in many ways, because they are women operating within these patriarchal systems.
Wonderful. And so, before we conclude, a more sort of general question to you. I mean, broadening this to communities and groups and identities outside of the Afghans and Afghan refugees. I feel like your framework is really interesting because all these ideas of urban citizenship, informality, you know, surveillance, all of these, and racialization, they can be sort of used as frameworks to understand multiple identities across Pakistan and the state-citizen relationship. And so I just wanted to ask, because, you know, the story of the city, almost to me, reading your work, seems to be in some kind of juxtaposition with these bigger sort of tropes at the more national or sort of mainstream level, right? So you have all these tropes and you have all this racialization and you have all these narratives of like the other. But at the level of the locality or the neighborhood or the Kachi Abadi, there's something else happening. And your microhistories are really important in drawing out this really interesting, what you refer to as a shared or mutual struggle between, you know, all these communities that are coexisting. And at some level, the ethnic or the domiciliary sort of identity, which seeks to sort of divide at a larger level, is actually at this level sort of coming together, if not in a syncretism, it's at least peacefully coexisting or peacefully kind of coming together for at least asserting rights. And I just wanted to say, if you might, you know, have a few words right at the end to say something about what was the impact of these Afghan refugee communities on the local communities, because that's also really important. You know, how did they receive them, and what did this shared struggle look like?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the story is a shared class story in these local communities. Ek lihaz se, it's a shared class story of the poor, of informal groups. On the other hand, it's a shared story of, you know, particularly in Peshawar, a city that was allowed to become the front line to war in the 1980s, 1990s, and still was allowed to become frontline city, subject to mass various forms of violence, not just Peshawar, but KP and Fata and that kind of region. You know, it was allowed to face, you know, bombs in the 1980s. Ye bhi tha ke Soviet Union and the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan would send their agents, and there used to be blasts within cities of like Peshawar as well. And, you know, government documentation at the time was quite happy for cities in KP and Balochistan to take the brunt of the migration as well. And this is where you had, you know, over 330 refugee camps, most of which were in KP and Balochistan. So in a way, it's telling these shared kind of struggles, both at a class level, but also at the unequal geographies that are produced within Pakistan and how it is that people navigated that. And I think a lot of the times, because different communities were facing the same levels of pressure, these were not necessarily the hubs of xenophobia. A lot of the times, the more xenophobic attitudes of kind of deportation come back, and this is a similar story, not just in Pakistan, this is not unique to Pakistan, but a lot of the times anti-migrant xenophobia and racism is often produced by communities and by groups who have the least interaction with migrant groups and communities. In the UK, a lot of the times people who voted for Brexit, which is often seen as a racist vote, were people who were not living in London or in neighborhoods that were multicultural. In Germany, the right-wing AfD, similar kind of like story. A lot of the times it's these rural areas or cities where you have limited kind of interactions, where these kind of xenophobic rhetoric is produced. So a lot of the times these communities kind of working with each other and how they transformed the local communities were because they were already themselves in many ways being transformed by the weight and by the pressure of migration that was allowed, or they may be communities and groups that already face pressures of being hyper invisible because of their poverty. And so these shared kind of struggles and shared inequalities and shared forms of discrimination that they face almost enables and allows cooperation to take place. Cities like Peshawar have been massively transformed by an Afghan presence. Afghanistan has been massively transformed by the diaspora that was in Pakistan. Look at the Afghan cricket team, which is wonderful and has had so many experiences of tape ball cricket and of street cricket in Peshawar. Many people had lived across the border and transnational lives. Many people have married in cities like Mardan, Sawabi. There are many marriages between Afghans and Pakistani citizens that have taken place. There has been a cultural kind of like impact and exchange in places like Karachi as well. And these are all important transformations and important shifts. And the reason why they become important is just not, again, to kind of like, for us to imagine these transformations, because it's been a long time. It's been 40 plus years. So in many ways, in sociological terms, this large refugee population, many of whom have become refugees in the first place because of actions that have taken place, not just in Afghanistan. It's not just that refugees ban gaye the and bas zameen se, zameen pe pahunch gaye, asmaan se gire, zameen pe pahunch gaye. Why have people become refugees in the first place is a question that I think more and more of us should be asking. Palestinians didn't just become refugees overnight. There was something that happened that made them become refugees. Why can we, and I'm using the we here, of course, not for the folks who are here in the room, but more as a figure of speech, but why is it that we in Pakistan don't ask that question, that where did Afghan refugees come from? Is there a responsibility that we have and that we fail to account and instead just say, but it's a difficult country, it's a haphazard country, the geographies are different, the politics are difficult. And what can we do to reflect and to understand why people have been made refugees in the first place? But also to understand Pakistani law, which actually does say from the legal perspective, citizenship laws in this country are actually very progressive, but are just never actually implemented. Millions of Afghans potentially should already be Pakistan citizens if we were to go in accordance with the citizenship laws, which when made by Pakistani lawmakers were incredibly open in many ways, limitations aside. Pakistani law does make provisions for migrants and for refugees. Even though Pakistan is not a signatory to many UN conventions, there is customary law that still applies. There are kind of many things that could apply, that could transform the Afghan story and perhaps should transform the Afghan story within Pakistan. But it really does require self-reflection that many people are not willing to take into account. Sometimes often saying, well, Pakistan, we have our own problems. Well, every state has its own problems. In Europe, they talk about deporting, Muslims all the time and will potentially, the AfD in Germany has what it calls a repatriation plan of its own for Muslim migrants. Does that mean it should happen? No. Just because, these things are happening elsewhere doesn't mean that this is something that needs to happen here. Pakistan has many problems of its own. Pakistanis have many problems of its own. Some of those problems have not been created by those people who have been forced to become refugees. Some of their problems are problems we have created. And if we could reflect on those, that becomes an important part of pushing, we hope, for something of a better world for all of us.
I am not going to encourage a round of applause because Yusra sort of, yeah, I mean, might just go back to sleep. So, in the interest of mother and baby and their peaceful sort of rendezvous right now, But I do want to say thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. If it's okay with you, can we have like a 15-minute Q&A?
Of course, of course.
Okay,
Ji,
wonderful.
bilkul.
So I'm going to invite Adnan to actually come and replace me here on this seat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Myself, Adnan Bajwa, and Dr. Saiba, I must say that being a Punjabi, being a Lahori, I had certain reservations. I had certain misconceptions about Afghan refugees, my own practicality or pragmatism, whatever you say. But actually, your talk, your discussion has really greatly helped me to get rid of certain biases, I must say. So thank you very much, first of all. I have certain questions, but I would like to ask audience first if they have any. Okay, actually, our colleague Dr. Khan is very specific about giving chances to women first. So yes.
चले खैर सवाल मेरा जो है वो इट्स अबाउट लैंग्वेज बैरियर बिकॉज यूनिसेफ just given a project to Pehchan, and I've been to a workshop and they are saying that they need people those can interact easily with Afghan refugees, Pashto speaking or whatever the language is. So how you overcome that barrier?
No, it's a good question. Like I learned Pashto. I'm not Pashtun. I'm Kashmiri. From my Pakistani side, my father's is Yemeni via East Africa, so I'm only half from the region myself. So learning the language became important. To be a serious scholar of Afghanistan and of Pakistan and Pashtun areas, you do need to learn the languages to be able to interact. My Pashto is not very good though, but I was able to kind of understand and to discuss and to learn and to make the effort to learn becomes important. Lekin zahir hai us lihaz se it's not going to be of that level. But most people do, especially in cities like Karachi, can also speak Urdu quite well. A lot of the times, because that also sometimes can limit, like in some of the more lower income areas in Peshawar, I would often be able sometimes to talk to men and not to the women. And that was also to do with language, because maybe the women hadn't been out in the world as much and things like that. So there are limitations, and language is important. There are ways of navigating it. Sometimes you could work with the translator, but making the effort to learn the language, I think, is important if you are going to be a researcher on the area and on the region. Thank you.
Yeah. So there's this burgeoning academic discourse on liminal spaces, particularly suburban liminal spaces. So how do you see these refugees navigating and constructing, sociologically speaking, those suburban liminal spaces, number one? And number two, when you look at post-colonial Lahore, for instance, what you see is not urbanization, strictly speaking. What you see is suburbanization. So was the same the case with Karachi and Peshawar? And if so, how were those refugees navigating those suburbanized liminal spaces? And thirdly, as we look at some of the discourse, we get to see that over the past 40 years or so, the neoliberal commodification has produced a, self-made, is typical city-style structure. So do you see that replicating, or why Peshawar? Why Karachi? Like, why was this difference? Was there a particular characteristic archetype that was present in Peshawar, for instance, that was not present in the cosmopolitan city, for instance?
So, I think that urbanization has been happening. I think suburbanization is happening in one way. You have gated communities, you have, different kind of areas being produced, but it is still people flocking to the city. It is urbanization in the sense of kind of more and more people kind of moving to the city, more and more kind of people migrating to the city, even if, you have suburban places being formed, even if you have what Mohammed Qadir calls ruralopolises being formed, that is where rural areas are becoming more urban. So you have this kind of like taking place and transformations taking place, but perhaps I didn't fully understand the question. Maybe I can ask you to repeat, maybe the middle question on.
Yeah, so the middle question was what we see in post-colonial Lahore, for instance, is not urbanization, strictly speaking, but
Right.
suburbanization.
Okay.
So was it the case with Peshawar and Karachi, for instance? And if so, how were the refugees navigating those
And what do you mean
liminal
by
spaces?
suburbanization? Like, what do you mean
It's a
by
standard
that?
term, the urban sprawl. Like
Yeah.
cities do not develop in the Eurocentric way. Cities
Yeah, of
develop in
course.
the
Yeah, yeah.
suburban, not horizontally, but vertically.
Yeah, I mean, Karachi very much develops vertically, I think, right? It's a very much building on top of building on top of, but the urban sprawl is absolutely there. In Peshawar, you see these massive kind of like urban sprawls taking place. The third world, so, you know, Mike Davis, Planet of the Slums, this wonderful book written in 2006, radical urban geographer who's passed away 20 years on from his book publishing, 2005 it was published. We asked this question, do we still live in an era where you see rapid third world urbanism taking place, where it's horizontal cities that are kind of like growing and becoming bigger rather than the Eurocentric city? Well, of course, the answer to that is absolutely. That's kind of what the city looks like. The third world and the post-colonial city has also in many ways reconfigured what we mean by the city. Urbanization is actually not a fun thing necessarily. In many ways, it can be dystopian and very, very terrifying, in which migrants have an important role, in which the poor have an important role, and levels of exploitation are actually quite terrifying, and in ecological terms have a huge impact. Lahore, bilkul, Lahore, from the Lahore that I knew from when I was a kid to Lahore now, I don't recognize the city. And a place that I used to love is now 10 degrees hotter, at least, than it used to be. मुझे याद है मेरी अम्मी मुझे कहती थी कि लाहौर में बहुत गर्मी है, 33 डिग्रीज है, 37 डिग्रीज है. मैं उनसे बात करी थी, मैंने कहा अम्मी जान सुनिए अब 30s की बात ही नहीं है. It's a really hot city because of the ways in which things... and so I think that's a fair point, that we see the cities in many ways, they're almost Darwinian in the sense of like...
prefigured with the refugees. My question was, how are these refugees navigating those new emerging suburban spaces?
Well, they're not...
particularly South Asian in their structure.
Yeah, I don't think they're just navigating, they are a part of it. They are building it, they're transforming it, they're being exploited by it. And this little madam is, yeah, I know what you're up to.
So, yes, we can ask this question later in the...
Yeah.
Ma'am, how do we see the impact of refugees coming from the same ethnicity on the local ethno-nationalist movements?
Ji, bilkul.
Does it create more issues for national integration than the local movements? If yes, then why it seems inhuman to send them back to their own country?
बिल्कुल, ये बहुत अच्छा सवाल है आपने पूछा. ये ख़ासकर कराची में काफ़ी डिस्कशंस एंड काफ़ी डिबेट्स हुए इस मामले के ऊपर. ख़ासकर ये अक्टूबर 2023 जो डिपोर्टेशन शुरू हो गई थी, उसके बाद उन्होंने काफ़ी कॉन्वर्सेशंस हुई है इस मामले के ऊपर. अगर आप कराची के अंदर देखें तो देयर इज़ अ लॉट ऑफ काइंड ऑफ एनिमोसिटी इवन अमंगस्ट द पॉलिटिकल लेफ्ट towards kind of the Afghan refugee population. Deportations जब हो रही थी तो कुछ लोग ये भी कह रहे थे कि उनको जाने दे. उन्होंने कितना खप लगा दिया है कराची के अंदर, कितने मसले, so many difficult problems happening within Karachi. Even amongst progressive forces were saying that actually the Afghans should go back. And a lot of the times this is to do with creating the tensions that are particular to Karachi. We know that there are tensions over land. Land grabbing is so much more common than in the feudalesque spaces, say, of Lahore, right?
Great. And your topic, refugee cities, is very difficult, I think so.
Ji.
My question, Maryam asked you, discuss different ways. My question, how dominate the cultural impacts of Afghanis and the Pakistani communities? Is it dominated by Madam, a lot of questions are discussed about you. My question is the commitment, what is the domination of the culture? Either the Afghan peoples come to Pakistan and they dominate the culture over local community, or the local community impact the culture to their own living style?
बिल्कुल नहीं.
Thank you for asking this.
नहीं, बहुत अच्छा क्वेश्चन है. देखिए, जब माइनॉरिटी आती है, numerically they're in the minority. The Afghans are in the minority, even if it's a large presence in cities like Peshawar. And whenever you are a minority, you ultimately adapt to the majority, depending on what the majority is like. If the majority is inclusive, if it's open, if it's willing to adapt. लेकिन side by side आपकी influences भी होती है as a minority. तो दोनों तरफ से influences होती है. लेकिन ज़ाहिर है माइनॉरिटी को थोड़ा ज़्यादा अडेप्ट करना पड़ता है क्योंकि उनकी ताकत थोड़ी कम होती है और दे आर ट्राइंग टू नेविगेट अ न्यू सिस्टम. If you are sedentary, if I lived in Lahore for 40 years versus somebody who comes and who goes and who comes and goes, the person who lives there for 40 years will be much more confident in the city than somebody who's new to a city. We all know this for when we travel or if we move somewhere new, our confidence in that space is a bit less.
So I have experienced a lot of Afghani peoples are working in my company. They are very hard workers. Not means hard working styles in 45 temperature. They work very hard. This is a very good thing for them. But one thing I have observed: thousands of Afghani people are working in Middle East or somewhere else by getting documentation of Pakistan. This is nothing happened in the rest of the world. It is only in Pakistan.
Thank you.
You know, in a situation where you've had a country just has been in war for 40 years plus, getting documentation and passports can often be very difficult. It is things that happen in other parts of the world. Different refugees, different migrant groups might go to other cities. Thinking of East African examples, East Africa mein Somali refugees or Congolese refugees, they might have to navigate other systems to be able to find work. So surviving in the nation state system jahan pe documentation and passports and ID cards matter, this is one of the survival strategies of trying to get to the Gulf or trying to earn an income that I guess Afghans do and others do as well. Yeah. We'll do.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम।
Walaikum assalam.
मेरा बेसिकली सवाल ये था कि मैं पहचान में काम कर रहा हूँ, तो हमारा एक सेंटर है सगियाँ के अंदर,
जी
ये लाहौर बेस्ड, वहाँ पर अफ़गान रिफ्यूजीज़ रहते हैं।
जी
तो हमें तकरीबन 3 साल हो गए हैं वहाँ पर काम करते हुए, हेल्थ के ऊपर काम कर रहे हैं, अवेयरनेस के ऊपर काम कर रहे हैं। लेकिन इशू ये आता है कि वो ऐसी कम्युनिटी है जो आपके साथ आपको फैसिलिटेट नहीं करती। फॉर एग्जांपल हम उनकी हेल्थ पे काम कर रहे हैं लेकिन वो हमारे साथ कोऑपरेट नहीं कर रहे होते। हमारी कम्युनिटी मोबिलाइजर जो हैं वो भी उनके पास जाती हैं लेकिन फिर भी वो इवन कि अपने चेकअप के लिए भी नहीं आ रहे होते।
जी
तो आपके लिए कितना मुश्किल था कि उनके साथ मतलब काम करना? वो तो एक क्या या ये चीज़ सिर्फ यहीं पर है या आपने उधर भी ऑब्जर्व की?
जी बिल्कुल नहीं, आई थिंक ये अच्छा सवाल है एंड आई थिंक कम्युनिटी इंगेजमेंट करना बहुत मुश्किल काम है, ख़ासकर अगर आप किसी इदारे से आ रहे हैं या कुछ हेल्थ सर्विसेज प्रोवाइड करने की कोशिश में होते हैं। ये ऑफ्टन टाइम्स क्लास का मामला होता है, ज़ुबान का मामला होता है, कुछ होता है भी कि कंस्पिरेसी थीरीज़ हमारे बहुत चलते रहते हैं। एंड ये ख़ासकर क्योंकि ऑब्वियसली इट वाज पोलिटिसाइज्ड अ लॉट फॉर द पास्ट 10 to 15 years, जहाँ लोग खुद the conspiracy theory is not because people are backwards themselves या वो ऐसे उनके दिमाग है or anything. There are reasons for their suspicion. There are reasons for this suspicion because of how, you know, I guess how health communities or health vaccinations or how different organizations have been weaponized in many ways for political things. So building trust is a very difficult kind of thing and I don't envy you. जो आपका टास्क है बहुत मुश्किल टास्क भी होता है कम्युनिटी को किस तरीके से इंगेज करने में। लेकिन ये जो आपने सवाल पूछा था पहले, ये लैंग्वेज की भी बहुत ज़रूरी होती है एंड लैंग्वेज इन टर्म्स ऑफ पश्तो, दर्री और मुख्तलिफ ज़ुबानें की ज़रूरत है। लेकिन ये भी है थोड़े से कल्चरल प्रैक्टिसेस को भी समझना, क्या फ़र्क है, क्या डिफरेंसेस है, क्लास का भी मामला होता है। सो आई थिंक इट्स अ वेरी डिफ़िकल्ट टास्क बट वन विद एजुकेशन एंड बेटर एंगेजमेंट एंड सीइंग गुड प्रैक्टिसेस। जो काम क्या अच्छा काम जा रहा है, कुछ इलाके हो रहे थे कराची में, उन्होंने काफ़ी पेनिट्रेट भी किया था, पेशावर में भी। वाई वॉज दैट वर्किंग, व्हाट वाज गुड अबाउट इट? A lot of the times it's the people that you have got engaged in the community work. It's hard work to do this type of action. I don't think कि अगर आपने health के लिहाज से किसी भी community में काम करना है वो मुश्किल काम होता है क्योंकि people are busy. ख़ासकर in these lower income communities आपने जाके कुछ initiative करना है, time is money.
आप उन्हें free services provide कर रहे हैं, फिर भी उसको hesitation होते हैं।
जी।
You can ask this question later on.
Thank you.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम, बहुत शुक्रिया। अभी आपने एक बहुत ज़रूरी उसमें चीज़ कही थी कि अब हमें उनको देखना या पढ़ना है कि वो अफ़गान रिफ्यूजीज़ वो क्यों बने। बट अब मैं ये समझना चाहूँगा क्योंकि अब तो अक्सर उनमें से लोग चले गए हैं एक तो स्टेट सेंट्रिक पर्सपेक्टिव था कि क्यों उन्हें निकाला गया या वो किस लिए आए। अब ये जो आपका सवाल था इसको हम किस तनाजुर में देखेंगे, इंसानी सलामती के हवाले से, ह्यूमन सिक्योरिटी के पर्सपेक्टिव में, या किस एंगल से देखेंगे? क्योंकि अब तो मेजॉरिटी लोग उनमें से यहाँ से जा रहे हैं, कुछ जो लीगल अगवान्स हैं वो रह गए हैं।
आई थिंक मैं अच्छा सवाल है ना। आई थिंक देखिए कि काफ़ी लोग रह भी गए, लेकिन एट इट्स पीक देयर वर एटलीस्ट 8 मिलियन के ऊपर अफ़गान्स थे पाकिस्तान के अंदर। बहुत से लोग चले गए थे वापस अफ़गानिस्तान इन ये दरमियान में 2001 2021 बिफोर द तालिबान केम इन, बिकॉज देयर वर अपॉर्चुनिटीज़, जॉब अपॉर्चुनिटीज़ थी काबुल में। कुछ डिपोर्टेशंस के हवाले से चले गए हैं, कुछ प्रेशर्स उनको फील कर रहे थे, महसूस कर रहे थे कोई ब्लास्ट होता है हम पे ऊपर इल्ज़ाम आता है तो हम चले जाते हैं। And a lot of people moved, a lot of Pakistanis moved as well and moved. So people just do this outward migration because हालात पाकिस्तान के अंदर भी ख़राब हो चुके हैं। लेकिन ये है कि there's still quite a few people who have remained and यहाँ पे रहेंगे भी। Over 90% of the Afghans who live in the country have been here for more than 30 or 40 years and ये जाने नहीं वाले। So it's almost in the state's interest to regulate the populations. जो populations उनके अंदर है उनको regulate करें, उनको absorb करें। उस just from a it's not a very radical thing to say,
Thank you. So I will just ask some questions that are related to cultural practices specifically. So my first question would be, what were the different tribes that actually, specifically major tribes that moved towards Pakistan, and then of course there must have been different tribes in Pakistani side as well. So उनका आपस में integration का बाइसेस भी होंगे एक दूसरे को लेके, तो किस तरह की कल्चरल प्रॉब्लम्स थी, लिंग्विस्टिकली प्रॉब्लम्स थी यहाँ के जो पश्तून्स थे और जो वहाँ से आए? आई मीन उन्हें आप अफ़गान कह लें या पश्तून कह लें, एक ही बात है। तो माय फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन वुड बी दैट, प्लीज़।
I mean, I think देखिए जो migrations जो हुई थी 70s and 80s में, they were really emergency migrations. थोड़े मुख्तलिफ थे from the migrations that continued on before 60s and 50s 60s में जो हुई थी। These were real political mass migrations. It was a real emergency situation जहाँ पे millions of people fled or were forced to flee because of shifting political circumstances when the Communist Party of Afghanistan came into power. And उसका ये असर ये था कि it wasn't particular tribes, it was pretty much entire villages from Hazarajat region, from Herat to Paktia to Nangarhar kind of moving. From Nangarhar moving. Yeah, you okay? So it was entire kind of populations moving, not simply kind of tribes moving. Then आपके सवाल जो इंटीग्रेशन के लिहाज से अगर हम सोचे, देखिए काफ़ी लोग जो शिफ्ट हुए थे खासकर केपी साइड्स में, they were Pashtuns. But these are often non-urbanized Pashtuns as well. Urbanized Pashtuns भी शिफ्ट हुए थे काबुल से, दूसरा भी ट्राई कर रही है, लेकिन ये भी इसको भूख लगी।
Second, that was very interesting comment that when you said that Karachi is a Afghan city actually. Very surprising. I don't know how Pashtun city. I don't know how Mahajis would take it. So specifically the tribes that are actually that have been living on the border area, specifically on the Afghanistan side and then Pakistani side, and और ये इसके बाद 2020 के बाद स्पेसिफिकली जब ये बॉर्डर जो सिक्योरिटी है इसको सीरियस लिया गया है, तो जो दोनों मुल्कों के जैसे आजकल एस्केलेशन होती है अफगान तालिबान के दरमियान और पाकिस्तानी स्टेट के दरमियान, तो जो ये एरियाज़ हैं इन्हें क्या कंसिक्वेंसेस का सामना करना पड़ता है? एंड सेकेंडली आपने कराची को और पेशावर को एज केस स्टडी के तौर पे स्टडी किया, लेकिन जो पश्तून्स, ये जो अफगान रेफ्यूजीज़ थे जो अदर पार्ट्स ऑफ कंट्री मूव हुए, स्पेसिफिकली इन पंजाब या सिंध के अंदर, बाकी अर्बन रूरल सिंध के अंदर, तो उन्होंने क्या इंटर मैरिजेस की? तो किस तरह की तब्दीली आई कल्चरल? और आखिरी क्वेश्चन ये है कि जिन सिटीज़ के अंदर ये मूव हुए, कल्चरली वो सिटीज़ को किस तरह से उन्होंने ट्रांसफॉर्म किया? कौन सी ऐसी प्रैक्टिसेस थी जो स्पेसिफिकली अफ़गान अपने साथ लेकर आए? आई रिमेंबर कुजीन स्पेसिफिकली लाहौर के अंदर अगर मैं बात करूँ तो बहुत सारी ऐसी डिशेज़ हैं जो बहुत सारी कॉमन हो गई अभी, एंड दे आर एक्चुअली अफ़गान कुजीन, बट हैव बिकम नाउ लाहौरी कुजीन स्पेसिफिकली। तो आप उस पर क्या कमेंट करेंगे? थैंक यू वेरी मच।
नहीं, आई थिंक थोड़ा क्रिकेट इम्प्रूव हो चुका था जब विद आवर पश्तून प्लेयर्स बिकॉज ऑफ द इन्फ्लुएंस ऑफ काइंड ऑफ the Afghan kind of like things as well. हम अक्सर ये ऐसे मजाक में भी कह लेते हैं, but I think देखिए, there's I think this cross-border, I think one thing that's really important to remember, ख़ासकर ये border regions के अंदर जैसे हमारी बात हो रही है, अगर former फाटा इलाके या border बिल्कुल ऊपर line के ऊपर होते हैं, oftentimes these are groups that have been suffering as a consequence of colonial legacies or as of the post-colonial state anyway. The biggest people who are affected in terms of Pakistanis are often those people in that border region जो हम खुद भूल जाते हैं या बात नहीं करते उनके ऊपर बहुत असर होता है, उनकी families exchange, marriages, intermarriages होती रहती है, and they're often the most directly affected. It's only in 2018 that FATA gets integrated into the Pakistani state, and we are still not in that place where we can say it's fully integrated.
Yes.
Yeah, there's still a lot of work to be done. It's only been 6-7 years since that integration has happened, and there's still massive inequalities within that region, and there is not peace within that region, not because of the people and because of the geographies, but because of decisions that are made by the very state of which we are a part as well, which doesn't view all life in very equal ways. And I think that is, it's the elephant in the room. जब हम अफ़गान refugees के ऊपर बात कर रहे हैं, तो obviously refugees के ऊपर भी बात हो रही है, लेकिन that Afghan story cannot be told without understanding the inequalities of the geographies and ethnicities that we have within Pakistan itself. And लोग जब कोशिश करते हैं इस मामले के ऊपर बात करने के लिए, it's a very difficult topic to talk about. Talking about Afghan refugees hasn't always been the easiest thing. I'm not always the biggest fan of nationalists, even if people have a lot of love and affection for the state as well. It's difficult to criticize. It's difficult to be critiqued, even if intellectually and politically, and even if I'm doing it as a scholar. So that can be a little bit difficult, I think, to deal with. But then in terms of marriages and intermarriages, I think it really depends on where you are. A city like Karachi, intermarriages happen very commonly, actually. Even agar hame pata hai ki, tensions here between Urdu-speaking Muhajirs and Pashtuns and Baloch and Sindhis. It's one of the most cosmopolitan cities, jahan har friendship circle, har auntie ki circle, har uncle ki circle mein aapko ek smiley nazar aayenge, Pashtun nazar aayenge, Urdu-speaking Muhajir nazar, Punjabi nazar aayenge. And that's kind of because of the way in which urbanization is taking place there. This links to that earlier question that you had asked before Yusra Jan had started to intervene, is that a lot of the Pashtun groups who were moving from Afghanistan, not groups, people and persons who were moving from Afghanistan into Pakistan, a lot of times you have newly urbanizing populations who are moving to city centers like Islamabad and like Peshawar. But obviously for those who are coming from rural areas, the village still really matters, your village identity. Gham khadi karna hai, to you do gham khadi in kind of like your villages. If you want to be buried, you want to be buried in your home villages. Yeah. So these identities matter, but as more and more urbanization takes place, graveyards shift from the village to the city, there are more intermarriages taking place, or more kind of, dating taking place, not just amongst Pashtuns, but Pashtun and Punjabi marriages, Afghan and Pakistani marriages along these different ways as well.
So thank you very much. Of course, किसी का और कोई सवाल हो तो वो चाय पे पूछ सकता है. बाहर चाय भी है और बाहर बुक स्टॉल भी लगा हुआ है, किसी ने किताब लेनी है. बज़्म-ए-आलम और आइडियाज़ की तरफ से ये बुक टॉक सीरीज़ जो है वो एक कंटिन्यूसली हो रही है पिछले काफ़ी देर से, और अभी भी होती रहेगी. इफ़ यू जस्ट फॉलो आवर पेजेस सो यू कैन गेट invitation for our upcoming book talks. Thank you very much for everyone for joining us, and Yusra ji, thank you very much for bearing with us. So that's all.
इन्होंने इजाज़त दी है. Thank you so much. Thank you.